Oh, there we are. Good morning, or hello. Welcome to our webinar this morning. My name is Jeff Greenbaum, and I am the head of the Public Policy Council for the International Advertising Association. And you are here joining us for the third webinar in our series on environmental marketing this year, new developments in environmental marketing regulation. This webinar is focused on developments in Asia Pacific and the Middle East. Earlier this year, we did webinars on environmental marketing developments in the Americas and in Europe, or actually EMEA, and or Europe and Africa. And I invite you to go back to IA's website and check those out as well. The reason that IA is conducting these webinars is that one of the things that IA really believes is that as regulations and as enforcement of these types of laws evolves around the world, education about these issues is tremendously important in order to ensure that companies comply with the laws as they are, but also, regulators are also continuing to think about the ways in which these laws should change and evolve. And it's important for people to understand what they are, what's working, what's not working, and that we have better communication and collaboration about these types of issues. So these webinars are part of a whole group of things that we're doing at IAA to really get the word out about sort of what's happening in the environmental marketing space, and then really try to put some smart thinking together about what should be happening. So I'm very, very happy to be joined this morning by 4 lawyers, all of whom are members of the Global Advertising Lawyers Alliance. The Global Advertising Lawyers Alliance is an alliance of advertising law experts from around the world. The Global Advertising Lawyers Alliance represents something like 95, 100 countries around the world. And so really, we've got this incredible organization that allows us to think about these issues on a true global scale. One of the hats that I wear is that I'm also the chairman of the Global Advertising Lawyers Alliance. So it is it's sort of my pleasure to bring this group together on behalf of IA to talk about these issues. So I'm not under any misapprehension that at this 6 a.m. Eastern time start time in the United States, I've got lots of people in the US watching live. So I do hope that they will come back and check this in on replay. But we set this time so we were able to get our friends from time zones that are dramatically different from our own to join us this morning. One of my favorite things about Peter, who is going to kick things off in a second from Australia, is that he and I share a birthday, even though our birthdays are on different days, just because of the time zone differences. So anyway, I will let each of our speakers introduce themselves briefly when we kick off our next topic for sake of simplicity, and since I'm so bad at introducing people. But what we'll do first is we're going to start here, and we're going to give you a little bit of an insight into different ways in which environmental marketing is regulated in each of the 4 jurisdictions represented here. And once we have a brief lay of the land in terms of the different choices that people are making from a regulation standpoint, then what we're going to do is we're going to cover some of what we consider to be the hot emerging topics that people are facing, both in the US and around the world. So I think with that brief introduction, I think we're going to kick things off. And so Peter Legay from Australia is going to tell us a little bit about the way in which environmental marketing is regulated there. Peter.
Thanks very much, Jeff. So I'm just going to be talking about now what the position is in Australia regarding the self-regulatory codes and law that applies in relation to environmental marketing. First off, we have the Australian Association of National Advertisers Environmental Code. That code's been around since about 2009 and got revised just in late 2022. And it's pretty straightforward. It's got 3 main tenets. Truthful and factual presentation is required. In other words, that means that it's not misleading or deceptive, that there's a genuine benefit to the environment, and that means it has to be relevant or specific and clearly explain the significance of what the claim's about. And then thirdly, substantiation. Obviously, the claim has to be capable of substantiation, verifiable. Now, going to the law, we're talking about the Australian Consumer Law, which is a schedule to the Competition and Consumer Act of 2010. It's a very well-known piece of legislation in Australia, and the particular provisions of the Australian consumer law that would apply to environmental marketing, indeed any form of marketing in Australia or advertising, would be Section 18. And Section 18 essentially deals with misleading or deceptive conduct, or conduct that is misleading or is likely to mislead or deceive. It's a very broad section, and it's probably the most litigated section in Australian legal history. Section 29 then deals with very specific types of false or misleading representations about goods and services. In particular, the ones that would probably apply to environmental marketing would be Section 29A, which deals with the prohibition on making a false or misleading representation that goods are of a particular standard, quality, value, grade, composition, style, or model, or have a particular history or particular previous use. And then paragraph B, that also deals with the same sort of thing, but in relation to services. And then you have G, which is the one that's probably the most applicable here, 29G, which is the prohibition on making false or misleading representations of goods and services have sponsorship, approval, performance characteristics, accessories, uses, or benefits. And lastly, the subcategory, or paragraph H, that there's a prohibition on making false or misleading representations that the person making the representation has a sponsorship, approval, or affiliation. And that would apply to situations where you've got certifications and the like. Then next slide, please, Jeff. I was just going to talk briefly about a guidance document that has been put forward by our consumer law regulator, the Australian Competition Consumer Commission, or the ACCC, which published a draft guidance on environmental and sustainability claims in July of this year. And so it's pretty well hot off the press. They also were requesting feedback from businesses and consumers, and that closed about the middle of this month. So we'll wait and see what happens in relation to those comments and feedback. But as you can see, there's 8 principles there. I won't go through each one of them, but they're self-explanatory in terms of what are the issues that have been raised and what needs to be covered off in sort of advertising and marketing. And some of these I will deal with later on as we're going through the discussion. Lastly, the Australian Securities Investment Commission, which is the regulator for financial services in this country, in Australia, has published an information sheet called Information Sheet 271. They're very, very creative in their names, and that is an information sheet on how to avoid greenwashing when offering or promoting sustainability-related products in a financial situation.
Hey, Peter, when do you think this draft guidance will be finalized?
That's a good question. I don't know. So because that feedback has only just come back in 2 weeks ago, I suspect it'll be several months before they finalise them. But at the moment, the ACCC, for those principles, those 8 principles, they're saying that those principles, as they've put out there as draft guidelines, are what they would recommend that you use in trying to avoid greenwashing in Australia.
And was there anything other than just increased interest in the issue that caused the ACCC to issue the guidance? Was there something specific you think that was happening in the market?
They had the ACCC did a internet sweep earlier this year where they found a swag of businesses who were making very questionable green or what they would call greenwashing claims. In addition to that, the idea of greenwashing has been on the ACCC's hit list, so to speak. They publish priorities of things that they investigate, and in 2022. That was up there on their list of things to investigate. This is also a reflection, I think, of what's been happening globally. There's been a fair bit of greenwashing claims around the world, and it is something obviously that Australia's now, or the regulators now, have really focused in on.
Right. Thank you, Peter. All right, let's switch over to Julika Wahlmann-Smith in New Zealand.
Thanks, Jeff. So as Jeff just mentioned, I'm Julika Wahlmann-Smith from Hesketh, a full-service law firm in New Zealand. And similar to Peter, I'm just going to run through the regulations we've got here in New Zealand. And as I do, you'll probably think they sound relatively similar to the position in Australia. And given we're somewhat close neighbours, that's unsurprising. So our environmental claims are largely regulated by our Fair Trading Act. So again, this is a piece of broad brush consumer protection legislation, which includes a general prohibition on misleading and deceptive conduct in trade. It also has more specific provisions, including, as you see on the slide there, Section 10, that you cannot engage in conduct that will mislead a consumer in respect of the nature, manufacturing process, characteristics, suitability for purpose or quality of goods. You're also required to substantiate all representations made, and you cannot provide false or misleading representations that goods of a particular kind, standard, quality grade, or composition, and the like. The Commerce Commission is our regulator that enforces the Fair Trading Act. And they too, although we're a bit ahead of Australia in this regard, as we put it in place in 2020, issued guidance in respect of environmental claims. And that guidance focused on some key principles, including that claims so the content must be truthful and accurate, must be specific. You have to substantiate the claim, use plain language, do not exaggerate your claims, take care when relying on tests and survey results, and consider the overall impression of a representation or an advertisement. Alongside that, we have our self-regulatory regime through our Advertising Standards Authority, which has an advertising standards code. And within that, there's a specific principle regarding environmental claims, being that environmental claims must be accurate and able to be substantiated by evidence that reflects scientific and technological developments. So that just gives you a quick overview of the position in New Zealand.
Great, thanks, Julika. Okay, now Kanu from India.
Hello everyone, I'm Kanu, a senior partner with the firm Krishme based in New Delhi. I handle intellectual property, advertising and marketing laws related matters. Well, as far as India is concerned regarding environmental marketing regulation, as of now, there is no dedicated statute or regulation for environmental marketing. The legal framework for environmental marketing is still evolving. In fact, recently the Advertising Standards Council of India has felt the need for a dedicated regulation to curb greenwashing practices. So ASCII, which is basically a self-regulating advertising body of India and has been recognized by the Supreme Court of India and other governmental departments. It is in collaboration with Department of Consumer Affairs of Government of India, has set up a task force which will examine regulations relating to environmental marketing across the globe and then review the green claims which are currently being made in India and come up with guidelines on sustainability and green claims. So today I'm going to discuss the key laws, regulations and guidelines which currently regulate environmental marketing claims in India. As of now, the Consumer Protection Act 2019, it is the primary law or legislation which prohibits unfair trade practices, including false or misleading environmental claims. Though the Act does not specifically talk about environmental claims, it prohibits all kind of misleading advertisements. So environmental claim does come under the purview of Consumer Protection Act of 2019. Under this Act, a Central Consumer Protection Authority has been established to enforce the rights of consumers. The central authority is empowered to conduct investigation into violation of consumer rights. It can institute complaints, order discontinuation of unfair trade practices and misleading ads, and it can also impose penalties on manufacturers, endorsers, or publishers of misleading ads, including misleading environmental claims. Code for Self-Regulation of Advertising Standard Council of India also regulates advertising in India. And again, this code does not specifically provide guidelines about environmental marketing claims, but the principles of the code do apply to green claims as well. The code mandates honest and truthful representation and requires advertising claims to be accurate and not misleading. Also, the code puts special emphasis on substantiation of claims with evidence and an adequate scientific basis. This substantiation has to be produced as and when called upon to do so by the Advertising Standards Council of India. Next slide, please, Jeff. Security and Exchange non-convertible regulations of 2021. This regulation has for the very first time defined green debt security, and Chapter 9 of the Operational Circular has provided the initial and continuous disclosure requirement for entities who are issuing or proposing to issue green debt securities. SEBI has been very active regarding greenwashing claims, and they have in fact issued a circular in February of 2023. This circular specifically lays down the do's and don'ts relating to green debt securities to avoid occurrences of greenwashing. This circular defines greenwashing as making false, misleading, unsubstantiated, or otherwise incomplete claims about the sustainability of a product, service, or business operation. And the circular mandates the issuer of green debt securities to continuously monitor their path, which they have undertaken towards more sustainable form of operation. They have to continuously monitor whether their path is resulting in reduction of the adverse environmental impact and contributing towards sustainable economy. And in fact, the circular is very clear that the funds which have been raised through green bonds should not be utilized for any other purpose, and misleading labels are prohibited, and there should not be any hiding of trade-offs or cherry picking of data from the research to highlight green practices and hiding unfavorable practices. So the circular is very clear, and it prohibits making of untrue claims giving false impression of certification by a third party entity. Another important authority who has been active in this regard is Bureau of Indian Standards, who have issued standards for eco-labeling of products and services. I think this explains the position, the current legislation and the position in India.
When were those standards by the Bureau of Indian Standards issued? How recently?
It has been there for quite some time. It's not recent. The Bureau of Indian Standards has issued the standard for eco-labeling of products and services from quite some time. It has been quite some time.
All right, thanks. All right, now we'll go over to David Wolberg from Israel.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Jeff. I'm David Wolberg. I'm Kuperschmit and Goldstein's partner in charge of advertising and IP matters. Israel is the gala member in Israel. There is no environmental marketing law in Israel, but it's absolutely clear that the consumer protection law applies. Now, the consumer protection law prohibits misleading consumers. That's the main objective of the law. That's the gist behind it. Be truthful and don't mislead. Now, it's obvious that the consumer protection law applies to environmental marketing. If a company states that its product is environmental friendly, the product should be environmental friendly. Section 2 of the consumer protection law is very, very broad. It doesn't use the wording environmental marketing, but it's absolutely true that it applies to environmental marketing law. I have no doubt that if a company misleads as far as environmental marketing is concerned, the court will find them in breach of Section 2. I think it's a class action waiting to happen. The Clean Air Law 2018, which you can see on the slide, does actually relate to environmental marketing. It's very specific on the way vehicles can be advertised. It's about information about CO2 discharge, gas consumption, and so on. But I'll talk about that as we move along in the panel. We have a section about carbon discharges, so I'll talk about it in the future in the next few minutes. The Handling of Packaging Law 2011 specifies the manner in which companies produce and recycle packaging. However, it's not that relevant to the way these companies act vis-a-vis the consumers. That's about it. Moving on.
Is there anything on the horizon? Are there any discussions about sort of more specific environmental regulation?
Well, the truth is, we have a new environmental and protection minister. She was appointed when the new government was appointed about 9 months ago. And she does mention in general that she is taking this area of environmental marketing very seriously, and we should expect laws in the future. But I wouldn't count on it right now because Israel is dealing with other issues right now, constitutional issues. The Supreme Court, I don't see many changes in environmental marketing in the near future, unfortunately.
All right. Thanks, David. So, the next topic we're going to talk a little bit about is how you substantiate environmental marketing claims. I mean, in the United States, your advertisers are responsible to have a reasonable basis for their claims. What level of substantiation required it kind of depends on the type of claim you're being made, the risks and benefits associated with the type of claim you're making, and what would happen if it's a false claim, and also what experts in the field would expect to be the type of substantiation you would have. Often when you're making environmental claims, the FTC in the United States would require competent and reliable scientific evidence. I think one of the things to hone in here that would be interesting to hear, we'll talk a little bit from each person, is the extent to which when you're substantiating environmental claims, it's enough to prove the claim itself, or whether the law requires a larger life cycle analysis to understand all of the impacts associated with the product. I think that's number one. And second, I think another issue that we'd love to get some insight into in particular is, one of the areas in environmental marketing in particular that's been of interest to regulators is whether advertisers should be required to state the basis for the claims themselves, right? Ordinarily in the United States, you can make a claim so long as it's truthful. There's no requirement that you actually say or provide what the basis is or the backup for those claims. But I think we're seeing both, in some areas in the United States and around the world, governments saying, well, in the area of green marketing, it's important for consumers to be able to sort of evaluate those claims by seeing what they're based on. So let's sort of see what's happening, and we'll start with Peter.
Okay, thanks. Look, I omitted to introduce myself earlier, so I am Peter Legay from a law firm in Australia called Thomson Geer, full-service law firm, and we're a large independent firm. Anyway, getting back to the topic at hand. So in Australia, in terms of substantiation, the first thing we need to go to would be, if you're looking at those guidelines that the ACCC had put forward that I mentioned earlier, Principle 2 would be the one that would apply here. You must have evidence to back up your claims. And you must have a reasonable basis for the claim. So similar to the United States, it's the same here in Australia. However, that also includes if you're making representations about future matters, then such as you're saying something that you are either promising, forecasting, or predicting in the future, then such as, for example, in an environmental marketing situation, emission targets or sustainability targets, then you're also required to have reasonable grounds for that representation, that future representation. One of the big things for substantiation is independent and scientific evidence is the most credible that you can have. And if your evidence is lacking in credibility, don't use it. I've seen cases and been involved in cases where people have used scientific or dodgy scientific evidence, and it gets worse for them. Take reasonable steps to verify information provided by third parties, such as your suppliers. Don't take the supplier's word for it. It's simple as that. Conduct your own verification of the supplier's claims, and if you can show that you've taken reasonable steps to do so, then it's likely that you're not going to be held liable for something that might be problematic. Use widely accepted or peer-reviewed scientific studies, and the more relied on and the more peer-reviewed, the better. Ensure that the laboratory testing conditions actually reflect real-world conditions. So it is important that the testing that is done reflects what will be normally experienced by a consumer in the house, in the home. Then if claims are relating to environmental impact, then you need to calculate the reductions using accepted methodologies and keep robust records to verify those claims. Because if substantiation is requested, then you need to be able to provide evidence of that. And lastly, but not least, research, evidence, or data should be readily available to customers at all, consumers at all time. So that if somebody wants to know more about how you've made that claim, what you've based it on, you should be able to provide them with that information and do so in a form that they're going to be able to readily understand.
And are you required to do that? Is it, if a consumer or a competitor will request the basis, you'd be required to provide it?
You should. I mean, you may decide not to give it to the consumer, but then if the consumer makes a complaint to the ACCC, then the ACCC thinks it's something they should follow up, that's going to be more problematic. So, in those sort of circumstances, you'd be better off providing the consumer with the evidence that they're seeking.
Great. Thanks, Peter. All right. And Julika.
So in New Zealand, it's similar again. So both in our Fair Trading Act and in our Advertising Standards Code, there is a requirement to substantiate claims made, and you have to have reasonable grounds for environmental claims at all times that you're making the claim. And so that's quite important because often things change. People might do all the relevant testing right at the start, they make the claim, but then a few months on, maybe things have moved on, maybe reporting's changed or best evidence has changed, and you need to make sure you're always keeping on top of that to see what's happening. In relation to what's considered reasonable grounds, it does depend on the type of claim that you're making, but examples include having adequate test results, research, or other credible evidence. It should reflect scientific and technological developments. Definitely don't rely on unsupported opinions or assumptions. We did have, we've had this tested a few times by the ASA in particular, but an example of substantiation which was considered sufficient was, so Roundup had a weed killer which it claimed to be 100% natural, and it turned out that all the ingredients did end up being natural, and that was all set out in their data safety sheet, which was required to have, and the labelling on the product, and the ASA considered that to be acceptable to substantiate that claim.
Great. Thanks. All right, Kanu.
Well, ASCII's code for self-regulation, it requires that all the descriptions, claims, or comparisons which relate to matters of objectively ascertainable facts, they should be capable of substantiation with evidence and adequate scientific basis. And this substantiation has to be produced as and when called upon to do so by Advertising Standard Council of India or by central authority under the Consumer Protection Act. So substantiation is definitely required. And the credibility of environmental marketing claims can also be ensured by eco-labels such as EcoMark or Bureau of Energy Efficiency Star label. And they can also be substantiated by EMS certifications and life cycle assessments. And next slide, please. Some of the relevant certifications for environmental claims include EcoMark scheme, which is administered by the Bureau of Indian Standards. And the presence of this eco logo along with ISI mark, it indicates that a product has met certain environmental criteria along with the quality requirements as specified in the relevant standard, which has been issued by the BIS. And there is an Indian Green Building Council, which is part of the Confederation of Indian Industry. It also offers certifications and develops new green building rating programs and green building training programs. And then Confederation of Indian Industry also has a Green Pro eco-label certification, which is actually a type 1 eco-label certification for building materials such as cement, steel, glass, tiles, etc. So, these certifications, they do provide credibility, but again, substantiation in the form of evidence and adequate scientific basis is required, and it has to be produced whenever the ASCII or central authority under the Consumer Protection Act demands it.
All right, David.
Generally speaking, as a rule, you don't need to substantiate environmental claims. You don't have to substantiate any claim unless you're involved in a case law, unless you're involved in a legal suit, and then you have to prove it. But You will also have to substantiate if the Consumer Protection Commissioners forces you to reveal supporting evidence. Evidence should be objective, professional, and when appropriate, scientific. The law doesn't define how to substantiate environmental marketing claims, but the rules of evidence that apply to all areas apply to environmental marketing. Before submitting evidence to the court, I always tell my clients, put yourself in the judge's position. You're the judge. What would convince you? Every case is different. Rule of the thumb, if you're making scientific claims, back it up with scientific evidence. Scientific evidence could be lab results, an affidavit signed by an objective scientist, and etc. The point is, the more scientific your claims, the more specific and scientific you will have to be. A note from your mother won't really help you in this sort of situation. But again, rules of evidence apply to substantiating environmental marketing claims. That's about it.
All right, thanks, David. Next issue I want to spend a little bit of time on is to talk about general environmental benefit claims. A general environmental benefit claim might be something like a product is eco-friendly or a product is green. In the United States, the general principle is that advertisers should avoid making general environmental benefit claims because of the concern that they could convey a wide range of meanings that could not be substantiated by an advertiser. And what the Federal Trade Commission says here is that if you're going to claim that your product is green or eco-friendly or something like that, don't. But if you really have to, then what you have to do is you have to qualify the claim so that consumers understand what the specific environmental benefit is. But again, even if you do that, you still have to think about how the claim is going to be interpreted in context to be sure that it doesn't convey broader and misleading meanings. So let's see what the view is on this issue around the world, and we'll start with Peter again. Peter, are you on mute? Peter is on mute, I think.
There you go. Sorry about that.
Okay.
The position in Australia is simply is pretty much the same as what you mentioned, Jeff, as the position in the US. Again, you need to avoid broad and unqualified claims, and given those principles I mentioned earlier, that comes into that principle 5 of those 8 principles. And without clarification, consumers can be easily misled or deceived into thinking that the good or service is better for the environment than it actually is. And the ACCC in their guidelines actually recommend avoiding similar terms that you mentioned, Jeff, and that is green. They see these terms as not really informing consumers of the environmental benefits of a product or service. And green they see as being vague and unhelpful. Environmentally friendly and eco-friendly, again, they see that as being vague, and it risks consumers thinking that there might be no harm to the environment as a result of the product or service that's either environmentally friendly or eco-friendly. And as for sustainable, then they see that as just a general sort of phrase, again, that should be avoided. And again, risks consumers thinking that there might be no harm to the environment as a result of the sustainable nature of the product or service. One thing the ACCC takes a view about is that they say that really every product or service has some sort of adverse impact either through its manufacturing, packaging, delivery, or use on the environment. There's very little in the way of products or services that wouldn't have some sort of adverse impact. So they see those four particular phrases as being unhelpful and should be avoided. The other ones that I've put down here are ones that they think really should be further qualified or explained. So recyclable. The question that arises with recyclable is, can it actually be recycled, all of it? And are we talking about just the product, or are we talking about the packaging, or are we talking about both? Or if it is the product, what part of the product? So we know, for example, with plastic bottles, you can recycle the bottle, but not maybe the cap, for example. The next phrase that they think should be qualified or explained a bit more is recycled. Has it actually been recycled, or has it been simply recovered from waste? you need to go into detail about that as to what you're actually doing. Renewable energy, they say, please explain how any reasonable energy use has been calculated. So how does that come about? And the term free has been a value-laden term and a danger word for many years with the ACCC. And free, if you're saying something's free of a particular ingredient or characteristic, then it needs to be 100% free. Because as far as the ACCC is concerned, they think Australian consumers think free means absolutely free.
All right, thanks, Peter. Julika?
So in New Zealand, it's again similar to in the US and Australia. While general environmental claims are not banned as such, they're definitely seen as having a significantly increased risk of misleading consumers. Obviously, general claims can have a number of meanings, and under our Fair Trading Act, the intention of the advertiser when they make a claim is not relevant to considering whether it's actually perceived to be misleading or deceptive. If a claim can be interpreted in a number of ways, it risks breaching the Fair Trading Act if any one of those possible interpretations are false or misleading. The Commerce Commission suggests accordingly that advertisers should be very specific with their claims. Our ASA standards code also refers to any absolute environmental claims, such as environmentally friendly, safe, or kind, need to be assessed on the entire life cycle of the product and its packaging. So taking into account the effects on the environment of the manufacturing process, the distribution, the use, and its disposal. So obviously very difficult to comply with all of that. And then, of course, you need to substantiate it. And with any sort of general claim, a greater level of substantiation is required in order to be able to substantiate every single aspect that that claim can be interpreted as.
All right, Kanu?
Well, in India also the position is similar to that of US, Australia, and New Zealand, although there's no specific regulation or guidelines regarding general environmental benefit claims. The position is same. The code for self-regulation of ASCII, it prohibits use of statements or visual presentation which may either directly or by implication or by way of omission, ambiguity, or exaggeration can mislead the consumers. So it is always recommended that qualifying language should be used, which limits the environmental benefit claims to specific benefits. Also, those specific benefits are required to be substantiated with evidence and adequate scientific basis. Unqualified general environmental claims without substantiation may be considered misleading. So the terms like environment friendly, eco-smart, green, organic, they all may be considered deceptive or misleading. And so basically, general, unqualified, and broad environmental benefit terms should be avoided, as they may be considered deceptive or misleading in the absence of evidence substantiating such claims. And specific environmental benefits, if it is capable of being substantiated with the evidence, they are permissible under Consumer Protection Act and ASCII's code. So basically, the claim should not be too broad. It should be qualified, and it should allude to a specific benefit rather than being general claim.
Great. Okay, and David.
Again, the question of general or specific environmental claims is not mentioned in Israeli law, but we should be asking ourselves not if the environmental claim is general or specific. We should be asking ourselves, is it false or true? I have to say that general environmental claims seem to be more dangerous because they're harder to prove. And I also think this whole area of environmental marketing, there's the potential of a case reaching court. Because at the end of the day, I think consumers who are interested in environmental marketing are interested in getting truthful information. And you're quite at risk if you're giving false claims. I would steer away from general claims. It's much harder to prove that your product is environmental friendly than it is to prove that your product does 20 miles per the gallon. That's a yes or no question, but it's very hard to prove a general claim. A general claim could get you into trouble in court. That's it. Thank you.
So next issue I want to touch on is aspirational plans. Companies today are under a lot of pressure to show the marketplace and consumers kind of what they're doing and what their plans are. And companies frequently will make commitments like they're going to be net zero by 2030, or they're going to only use recycled packaging by 2035. And the question is those kinds of claims, those kinds of aspirational claims, a company's plans for the future, do those require the same level of proof that other environmental claims and other advertising claims require? Interestingly, in the United States, there's some disagreement about this issue. The National Advertising Division, our self-regulatory authority, has made it very clear that if you're going to make an aspirational claim, you should have a reasonable basis for that claim, which means having reasonable plans in place to ensure that you're going to get there. And then you also really should be taking steps already to reach those goals. On the other hand, there's been some litigation about this where courts have kind of said, well, we don't think that aspirational claims really rise to the level of specific advertising claims requiring proof. So we're keeping a close eye on that in the US to see how that issue is going to develop. So let's start with Peter.
Thanks, Jeff. So in terms of aspirational claims, I was thinking things like environmental improvements, more sustainable business models, and environmental goals and performances. And the first thing that comes into play is principle 8 of those 8 principles that I mentioned earlier, being direct and open about your sustainability transition. And again, clarity is key. Again, like the US, you still have to have reasonable grounds for making the claim, and the same applies to your future representations. Also remember, do not overstate the claim. By overstating the benefits of the claim, you're going to get yourself into trouble. Consider the overall impression that you're creating by an aspirational claim, and ensure that you have, and this is important, develop clear and actionable plans, because this will then justify the implementation of the various environmental initiatives the business is trying to put forward. And it'll also help provide the basis, the reasonable grounds for you for making the aspirational claims. If we can move to the next slide, please, Jeff. The next one is basing your goals on accepted methodologies and resources and technologies that are effective, and the key word here is currently available. There's lots of things. There's been cases where people have relied on methodologies, resources, and the like, or I should say technologies that are no longer current. They're old, and therefore that then gives a misleading impression. Consider how you will measure your progress and how you're going to explain it to consumers. Provide consumers with regular updates so they can see how you are developing your transition, your sustainability transition. And lastly, regularly review and revise your goals, as these may change, and it's important to constantly revise and update those goals. Thanks.
Okay. Julika?
So again, in New Zealand, you've got to have a reasonable basis for all claims that you are making. What is considered reasonable does depend on a variety of factors, including the nature of the claim. So our Fair Trading Act actually sets out factors that are considered when considering if the grounds you're relying on are reasonable. The nature of the goods and services the claims relates to, the nature of the representation made, so that's obviously important in relation to any aspirational claims, research and other steps taken, the nature of the information that you're relying on, the extent to which you've complied with any standards, if you're relying on any standards, codes or practices, and the actual and potential effects of the representation on any person. So there are quite a variety of factors that are taken into consideration when you're looking at the level of reasonable grounds for your substantiation for an aspirational claim, or for claims in general. But as in Australia, what is important, again, is that you're considering it at all times. The claim is made, making sure you're keeping up to date with what the relevant methodologies are, currently when you're making the claim, and reviewing it on a regular basis. Obviously, if you're making any claims that are outlandish or puffery, then that would not require substantiation, but likely to be of limited application in these sort of claims, I expect.
Okay. Kanu?
Well, there's limited framework for aspirational claims in India. In absence of specific guidelines regarding aspirational environmental claims, the general principle of ASCII code mandating truthful and honest representation applies. The aspirational claim should not be so far-fetched that they appear untrue, dishonest, or misleading. And guidelines for prevention of misleading ads, they prohibit misleading consumers by exaggeration or ambiguity. So any exaggerated or ambiguous aspirational claims are not permissible. The advertisers should have reasonable grounds for making aspirational claims. In other words, they should have a proper action plan, and they should have proper steps for making those aspirational claims true by the set deadline. So they should be able to prove the steps undertaken by them by way of evidences. And both ASCII code and guidelines for prevention of misleading ads, they require all descriptions, claims, and comparisons which relate to matters of objectively ascertainable fact to be capable of substantiation. So the evidences and substantiation, they are must, and they must be produced when required to do so either by the central authority or the Advertising Standard Council of India.
All right, David.
Aspirational claims are similar for all claims, either general or specific. They must be truthful and they cannot mislead consumers. You have to be prepared to submit and to substantiate those claims. Back up your claims with plans that you made, with targets that you set to yourself. And try to demonstrate how much you've improved over the past year and so on, if you're required to do so by the courts. I'm not aware of case law that actually touches that specific area. That's it. Back to you, Jeff.
All right. One of the hottest areas I think right now in the U.S. and around the world is marketers making claims about carbon neutrality. And so let's see what regulation we're seeing around the world on this topic. Peter.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Again, this falls under Principle 5 about avoiding broad and unqualified claims, because carbon neutral and offset claims can involve a number of complexities. But first and foremost is that the business undertake a thorough emissions baseline assessment using established Australian or internationally recognised methodologies, so that it provides itself and those who are going to be looking at the carbon neutral and offset claims, an understanding of where that's coming from. Secondly, clearly communicate the actions you've taken, which form the basis of the claim. And remember, you need a reasonable basis for the claim. Thirdly, explain how you've accounted for your Scope 2 emissions. By Scope 2 emissions, I mean indirect emissions that a business generates from a consumption of a third-party good or service. For example, electricity that a business would consume that is created by a third-party power station by burning coal. So not only your Scope 1, which is your direct emissions, but your Scope 2 emissions as well has to be accounted for. Provide information about the types of projects that have generated offsets. So you need to make sure that that's provided. If we can go to the next slide, please, Jeff. Again, you need to account for all types of greenhouse gas emissions, referring to some and excluding others. So just referring to carbon dioxide, it's not going to get you there. You got to refer to all of them. Otherwise, you might be creating a misleading overall impression. And where possible, make all relevant information readily accessible to consumers, as we've said previously. And lastly, ensure that the claims do not make or lead to a misleading impression. That's the overall point there.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks. So in New Zealand, carbon claims are of particular interest, as there's quite a push here to lower our carbon emissions. We've in fact got civic legislation in place, which is now Climate Change Response Act, which sets out a target of having net zero greenhouse gases, except for agricultural and waste, to reach net zero by 2050. So as you can expect, there's a lot of businesses here that are working toward that target, and along with that, we get the advertising that goes with it. So our Ministry of Environment have set out different aspects of guidance, which covers carbon offset and carbon neutral claims. This includes that such claims must take into consideration the entire life cycle of the product. Again, they point out that if you're only focusing on a certain aspect of the life cycle, the claim could be considered misleading. We did have a case, again, Advertising Standards Authority case, where a gas company had an advertisement that said New Zealand is heading towards zero carbon, so we're ensuring our gas is going zero carbon too. You know what that means for you? Absolutely nothing. You can continue to do what you love and help change the world without changing too much of yours. And then find out more at the gas company website. There was a number of complaints raised in respect of that advertisement. The ASA considered that the environmental claim was misleading and was not sufficiently substantiated, as unfortunately the efforts of the gas company to go reduce its carbon were actually only happening in 2050. In addition, suggesting to consumers that they didn't need to do anything to reduce their carbon footprint was also considered to be misleading. So the advertiser did try and soften the claim by amending it to refer to "we're helping New Zealanders go carbon zero too." But again, the ASA considered, given the timing of their plans and the fact that nothing had been implemented so far, that too could be considered misleading. In respect of,
sorry.
That's right. Yeah, in respect of carbon offset claims, you need to again be very clear in setting out what's being offset and how, and it must be for tangible activities that have already been put in place. So you can't make a claim that you're offsetting carbon by trees that you're about to plant. It has to be based on trees that are planted and are actually absorbing carbon in order to be able to make that claim. So
Cool, thanks. Okay, Kanu?
Well, again, there are no specific rules or guidelines about carbon neutral or other offset claims, but the general principle of ASCII code, which mandates truthful and honest representation, it also applies here. Therefore, any carbon neutral or other offset claims, they must be true and capable of being substantiated by evidence and adequate scientific basis. And the substantiation must be produced when the ASCII or the central authority asks for it. So claims should not be exaggerated or ambiguous, otherwise they would be considered deceptive or misleading. This SEBI, the Securities and Exchange Board of India, has actually mandated ESG disclosure for the top 1,000 listed companies by market capitalization from financial year 2022 to 2023. So although this ESG disclosure, the environmental, social and governance disclosure, is only for the top 1,000 listed companies, the small and medium enterprises and startups who are part of the value chains of these top 1,000 companies, they also need to align themselves with these companies' sustainability policies if they don't want to risk losing business from such companies. So we can safely say it's a major step by SEBI, which is going to have far-reaching effects. Another thing is, relevant certifications and ratings, they enhance credibility. For instance, Indian Green Building Council, which is part of the Confederation of Indian Industry, has green building rating systems and net zero rating systems and certifications. So while third-party certification, it does enhance credibility, they are not alternative or substitute for scientific research or testing, which is required for substantiating a claim.
Okay, and David.
This is one area that we do have legislation, and I don't have to say the General Consumer Protection Law applies. The Clean Air Law prescribes the manner in which vehicles may be advertised. The advertisements must contain information relating to gas consumption and CO2 and CO discharges. If you can move us to the next slide, please, Jeff. I'm sorry I didn't have time to translate this ad, but if you look at the bottom of it, the absolute bottom of it, you have a scale from 1 to 15. The more carbon friendly your car is, it'll be closer to number 1. And the more it pollutes, it will be at number 15 in the table. Number one is free, is no carbon discharge at all. And if you'll see the table on the bottom on your right-hand side, you have to specify how much liters you need for your car to drive 100 kilometers. You can see in this instance, it's 4.4 liters or 4.5 liters. And of course, the general rule of the consumer protection law applies, that you must be truthful and you can't deceive clients. That's about it.
All right, we're going to, as we're nearing the end of the hour, we're going to quickly talk about two specific claims, and then we'll give you some predictions about what's next. So, Peter, recyclable.
Okay, so as I noted earlier, recyclable is a term that needs to be qualified and explained. So you've got to be very specific about that part of the product that is recyclable. You obviously need to provide a basis for the claim, that it must be reasonable and transparent. And if the product is unable to be recycled in an ordinary recycling facility, then use of the term may well be misleading unless it is also appropriately qualified. So the other final point I wanted to make was that symbols can be misleading if not appropriately qualified, and under Principle 7 of those principles I mentioned earlier, visual elements should not give the wrong impression. I've used the Mobius symbol there for the recycling symbol. And again, it raises the question, is the product recyclable, or is it made from recyclable materials? Or does it apply to the product, the packaging, or both? So again, you need to clarify that when you're using a symbol like that, because if it's just like that alone, everybody will think it's not only recyclable, but it's also made from recyclable materials.
Okay, Julika?
So in New Zealand, if you're making any sort of unqualified recyclable claim, the whole product and its packaging must be recyclable. If there's only part of the product that's recyclable, that must be made clear. And when you're making these claims, you've got to consider our local environment and including what appropriate recycling facilities are available in order to avoid claims being misleading. So the coffee cup I've got there is an example of something that the Commerce Commission picked up. This is a coffee cup that has got a claim on it that it's recyclable. In fact, the producers of this cup did go to a lot of effort to ensure that the cup itself was, in principle, recyclable, and had lots of evidence from scientists globally that said it could be recyclable because it didn't have the plastic lining that normal coffee cups do. However, in the New Zealand curbside recycling, it doesn't accept coffee cups because most coffee cups are not recyclable, and it's too much of a job for the people at the plant to separate them out. So while in theory it's recyclable, it wasn't in fact recyclable at your local curbside recycling that you would do from your home. And so the Commerce Commission issued a warning saying that if you're going to make this broad brush claim, it needs to actually be readily recyclable as a consumer would expect here. And if it can only be recycled in certain places, that you need to make that clear with your representations.
Kanu?
Well, there's limited framework for recyclable claims in India, but again, it should be honest and truthful representation. There should be clear mention of the components of the product which is recyclable. The claim should not be misleading or ambiguous, and claim regarding 100% recyclable product would be considered misleading if only a portion of the product is recyclable. So the claim must be qualified and able to be substantiated with evidence and adequate scientific basis. So that's it. Right there.
Thanks. And David? David, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Sorry for that. The recyclable logo, the one that I displayed here on the right-hand side of the slide, I see it all the time. But it's funny that the consumer protection law or any other law doesn't define when a product is recyclable or not, or how you define a recyclable product. Again, you have to be truthful. You can't mislead consumers. You will need to provide additional information either by a court of law if you're sued, or if a consumer approaches you and asks you for information relating to the recyclable qualities, you'll have to give them this information. That's it. Moving on, Jeff.
All right, last topic, rules on seals and certifications. Peter.
Okay, first and foremost, sorry about that. First and foremost, ensure that the good or service does what you claim it does. So applying a seal or certification to a good or a service that does not do what the seal or certification says it does is definitely going to be misleading. Next, claims should accurately reflect the nature and scope of the certification scheme. That is, does the certification apply to the good or service or the business or both? Just be specific as to what it applies to. Next, ensure ongoing compliance with the certification scheme. These schemes sometimes change, so you need to keep them up to date. Next, ensure that the certification scheme is independent, transparent, reputable, and robust. So don't use a certification logo in a way that implies that a product or service has been independently certified if that is not the case. Next slide, please, Jeff. Do not disproportionately emphasize the certification scheme. So be careful how you describe the scheme. Consider what the scheme actually applies to, and consider the overall impression created and whether any further information or explanation would be required. And lastly, direct consumers to further information on the certification scheme at all times.
Great. All right, Julika.
So again, here in New Zealand, you need to be very clear and not misleading with any use of a certification or a seal. And we've got that prohibition in the Fair Trading Act in relation to any false or misleading representations in respect of any approval or endorsement. You do need to take a lot of care if you're using any seal or certifications that look similar to other legitimate certifications, as sort of mislead consumers. And if you're using any sort of your own environmental logo, again, if that's too similar to a seal or certification, it can risk consumers thinking it's something that's independently certified when it's not. So something to be very cautious of.
Right. Kanu.
There should not be any misrepresentation either directly or by means of implication that a product or service is endorsed by or certified by a third party when it is not true. Also, no reference to any person, firm or institution should be made without the explicit permission, especially if such reference confers an unjustified advantage. And awards, rankings or certifications, they are not alternatives for consumer or scientific research and or testing which is required for substantiating a claim. And awards, rankings in one category cannot be used to promote a product or service in another category. And all material facts, qualifications relating to endorsements or certification should be disclosed because if they're suppressed, they would mislead the consumers by implication or omission. So all material facts and qualifications should be disclosed.
Great. And David.
There is no specific law relating to seals and certifications. As usual, as I've been saying out throughout this whole panel, do not mislead consumers. Don't invent a certificate or a seal which is false. And if you use a certificate or a seal, do so without misleading consumers. That's it.
All right. So now what we're going to do is just a quick predictions about what's next. In the U.S., we are waiting for new guidance from the Federal Trade Commission on environmental marketing claims. We bet that will be out in the next several months or so, and that should be a big change in the marketplace. So let's see what's going on elsewhere. Australia, Peter.
Okay, in Australia, I'm just going to reference 3 cases that we've currently got in the federal court because they're going to give rise to some serious damages, or in terms of penalties, I should say. These are cases that are brought by ASIC, the Australian Security Investment Commission. We haven't had any cases brought by the ACCC yet, but I'm sure I know from doing that. This particular case, ASIC v Mercer superannuation, that was involving an investment option or an investment fund, where they claimed that it was suitable for members who are deeply committed to sustainability. Unfortunately, the fund had investments in companies involved industries that Mercer said had been excluded, such as carbon-intensive fossil fuels, alcohol, and gambling. Of course, the ASIC has alleged that they've made false and misleading statements and engaged in conduct that was likely to mislead. And they have the same sort of provisions under their ASIC Act as we do have under the Australian Consumer Law. They're seeking declarations, pecuniary penalties, injunctions, and orders that require Mercer to publicise any contraventions found by the court. And just to give you an idea of the penalties that they could be facing, so under the ASCII Act, the penalties are 50,000 penalty units, which currently translates to about 15.65 million Australian dollars. 3 times, and it's the higher of this, 3 times the benefit obtained and detriment avoided, or if they can't work that out, 10% of annual turnover capped at 2.5 million penalty units, which currently translates to about $782.5 million. Now, the situation with the ACCC under the Australian consumer law is that the penalties are slightly different and a little bit more. So, for example, they're similar but different. So under the Australian consumer law, penalties can be 50 million or 3 times the value of the reasonably attributable benefit that the company has got from the misleading conduct. Or if it can't determine that attributable benefit, then 30% of the corporation's adjusted turnover during the breach turnover period, which is a minimum period of 12 months. There's some very significant penalties, and the bigger the company, then the greater the penalty will be to make sure that it has meaning for that company. So this current case with ASIC, as I've said there, it's current. They've filed a statement of agreed facts, which means they're basically agreeing on the facts of the matter, and probably liability won't be an issue, and ultimately it'll be just a matter of penalty. But the matter is still currently listed for a 2-day hearing at the end of this year. The other two, again, it's the same sort of thing where they've claimed, if we can, sorry, move to the next slide, Jeff. This is ASIC v Vanguard Investments. Again, it's the same thing there. That's a fund that's marketed to investors who seek securities with ethically conscious screen, and the total funds in that fund is over $1 billion, which is important because that will have a bearing on the size of the penalty they will get. And again, it's the same thing. It's got ties to fossil fuels, including links to oil and gas exploration. They've alleged the same sort of things. They're seeking the same sort of things, and the matter's currently listed for case management on 27 November. The problem for Vanguard is that it's already been hit with an infringement notice late last year for $40,000 for other greenwashing conduct. So this is not going to be good for them. And the other one, if I can just move to the last slide, thanks, Jeff, is ASIC v LGS Proprietary Limited, or Active Super. Again, the same issue. It has a 13.5 billion in their superannuation fund, which again is going to be key when determining the penalty. Again, you'll see there their negative screen down the bottom says that they're not involved in tobacco, they're not involved in nuclear weapons, they're not involved in oil tar sands, and they're not involved in gambling. Well, out of those 4, they have investments in 3 of them. The only one they don't have is nuclear weapons. So it was, again, it's the same thing. They're seeking declaration, pecuniary penalties, and adverse publicity orders. And they have a case management hearing coming up on the 3rd of October. So by the end of this year, we'll have some idea of the sort of penalties that are going to come out of these sort of cases.
All right. Thanks, Peter. Julika.
So in New Zealand, I mean, like in a lot of countries, right, we're really seeing that rise of importance of ESG considerations across the board. And so we're seeing, companies are really interested in improving their environmental footprint, and obviously the government is trying to push that along as well, including with that Climate Change Response Act, which I referred to earlier. So I think it's definitely an area where we're going to see more and more focus, which along with that will normally come a bit of regulation, making sure that those claims are accurate as well, including it's an area that we expect to see more in the coming years.
Great, thanks. Kanu. Kanu, you're on mute.
Well, India is eagerly awaiting guidelines on sustainability and green claims, which is going to be issued by Advertising Standard Council of India in collaboration with Department of Consumer Affairs.
Great. And David.
When I'm hearing all the things that all the other panelists are saying, it's clear that Israel lacks clear legislation. I hope that in the future we'll have clearer legislation on the issue of environmental marketing. We can only assume that there'll be an increase in environmental marketing matters, which will reach the media and the courts. The media says the medial, so please disregard the L. Other than that, that's about it. Thank you, Jeff.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to all the panelists for providing some insights about what's going on, and thanks to all of our attendees. Thanks for joining us. Please keep an eye out for next year's webinar series sponsored by the IA, which is going to be focused on artificial intelligence, though I'm sure the conversation about environmental marketing is not over. Thanks again, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.